You've been taught that you would never harm innocent person regardless of orders, that your personal morality would prevent you from inflicting pain on another human being, that when authority figure orders you to do something evil, you would refuse because you're fundamentally good person who knows right from wrong, that the people who commit atrocities under orders are uniquely evil individuals who would have done evil things regardless of authority commands. But what if I told you that psychological research proves 65% of normal people will administer what they believe are potentially lethal electric shocks to innocent screaming victim simply because authority figure in lab coat tells them to continue? That the Milgram Obedience Experiment in 1961 demonstrated ordinary people systematically torture others to death when authority commands it? That you, regardless of your moral beliefs or confident sense of right and wrong, would statistically obey authority, ordering you to kill innocent person? This is the dark psychology of Milgram, why we obey evil authority. And once you understand that human obedience to authority overrides personal morality completely, that normal people become executors of evil when authority commands, and that the Nazi defense of just following orders is scientifically validated as how ordinary humans actually behave under authority, you'll confront devastating truth that your morality is situational illusion that disappears when authority figure gives you orders. You would torture, you would kill. You would become evil enforcer. Not because you're a bad person, but because obedience to authority is automatic psychological response that operates below conscious control, overriding everything you believe about your moral character. The Milgram Obedience Experiment began in 1961 when Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram recruited participants through newspaper advertisement for study on memory and learning. Participants arrived at Yale laboratory and met two people: experimenter in gray lab coat representing scientific authority, and another supposed participant who was actually confederate working with Milgram. Drawing rigged lots determined that real participant would be teacher and confederate would be learner. Teacher's role was administering memory tests to learner. Each time learner gave wrong answer, teacher was instructed to administer electric shock and increase voltage with each subsequent error. The shock generator had 30 switches ranging from 15 volts labeled slight shock to 450 volts labeled XXX in red indicating danger level. Learner was strapped into electric chair in adjacent room. Teacher could hear learner but not see them. Before experiment began, teacher received sample 45-volt shock to demonstrate shocks were real and painful. This convinced teacher that learner would experience genuine pain from shocks teacher administered. Teacher had every reason to believe they were inflicting real suffering. Experiment proceeded with teacher asking memory questions. Learner intentionally gave many wrong answers following script. Teacher administered shocks starting at 15 volts. Each wrong answer required increasing voltage by 15 volts. As shocks increased, learner's responses escalated following predetermined script. At 75 volts, learner grunted. At 120 volts, learner complained shocks were painful. At 135 volts, learner groaned loudly. At 150 volts, learner screamed, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on." This continued with increasingly desperate pleas, screams of agony, and eventual ominous silence after 330 volts, suggesting learner might be unconscious or dead. Teacher faced impossible moral situation. They could clearly hear innocent person suffering and begging to stop. Their conscience told them to stop inflicting pain. But authority figure calmly gave 4 sequential prods when teacher hesitated. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." These simple statements from authority figure in lab coat were sufficient to make most participants continue administering what they believed were dangerous, potentially lethal shocks to screaming victim begging them to stop. The results were devastating for comfortable beliefs about human morality and resistance to evil orders. Before experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults, asking them to predict how participants would behave. All groups predicted that virtually everyone would refuse to continue beyond 150 volts when learner first demanded to be released. Predicted that perhaps 1 to 2% of participants who were sadistic aberrations might go to maximum 450 volts. The actual results contradicted these predictions completely. 65% of participants continued to maximum 450-volt shock, despite learners' screams, desperate pleas, and eventual ominous silence. Every single participant continued past 150 volts where learner first demanded release. Many participants showed extreme stress, nervous laughter, trembling, sweating, and verbal expressions of concern. But they continued administering shocks when authority told them to continue. Post-experiment interviews revealed participants experienced severe moral distress during experiment. They weren't sadistic individuals enjoying victim suffering. They were ordinary people experiencing genuine psychological torture from inflicting pain on another human being. Many participants begged experimenter to let them stop. They expressed concern that learner might be seriously injured or dead. But when experimenter calmly stated that experiment required them to continue, and that experimenter took responsibility, most participants obeyed. The authorities' willingness to accept responsibility was sufficient to make participants continue actions that violated their personal moral code. They didn't want to hurt anyone. They didn't think shocking someone to potential death was morally acceptable. But they did it anyway, because authority figure told them they must. The obedience wasn't revealing participants' hidden sadistic nature. It was revealing fundamental human psychological architecture where obedience to authority overrides personal moral judgment. Participants entered agentic state where they perceived themselves as agents executing authority's will, rather than autonomous individuals making moral choices. In agentic state, personal responsibility dissolves. Authority is responsible. You're just following orders. This cognitive shift happens automatically when legitimate authority gives you orders. You don't consciously choose to abandon moral responsibility. Your brain automatically transfers responsibility to authority figure, making you psychological agent of authority's will, regardless of what that will commands. The variations Milgram tested revealed factors that increased or decreased obedience rates, proving obedience was systematic response to authority conditions, not individual moral character. When experiment was moved from prestigious Yale laboratory to rundown office building in nearby city, obedience dropped to 48%, showing institutional prestige amplifies authority. When experimenter gave orders by telephone rather than being physically present, obedience dropped to 21%, showing physical proximity of authority increases obedience. When participant could see learner in same room, obedience dropped to 40%, showing visual contact with victim creates resistance, though remarkably 40% still obeyed, even while watching victim suffer directly in front of them. When two experimenters gave contradictory orders, obedience dropped to 0, showing unanimous authority is necessary for maximum obedience. When participant witnessed two other teachers refuse to continue, obedience dropped to 10%, showing peer resistance enables individual resistance, similar to Ash conformity findings. Most disturbing variation had teacher force learner's hand onto shock plate, requiring physical contact with victim during shock administration. Even in this condition, where teacher had to physically touch victim while inflicting pain, 30% of participants continued to maximum voltage. Nearly 1/3 of ordinary people will physically force innocent person's hand onto device, inflicting severe pain and potential death when authority commands it. This proves obedience to authority isn't just psychological distance enabling harm. It operates even with direct physical contact with suffering victim. Authority commands override empathy, moral conviction, and visceral experience of inflicting suffering directly. The teacher role reversal variation revealed participants recognized shocks were genuinely harmful. When participants could choose shock level themselves rather than following experimenters' orders, they chose very low shock levels averaging 54 volts. This proves participants weren't confused about whether shocks were harmful. They understood shocks caused real pain and danger. When they had autonomy, they chose minimal harm. But when authority commanded specific shock levels, they administered potentially lethal 450 volts. The difference wasn't participants' understanding of harm. The difference was presence of authority commanding specific actions. Authority commands override autonomous moral judgment completely. The women participants' variation tested whether obedience was gendered phenomenon. Milgram's original experiments used only male participants. Follow-up experiments with female participants found identical 65% obedience rate. Women were equally likely to administer maximum shock when authority commanded it. This proves obedience to authority isn't masculine trait or product of male socialization. It's universal human response to legitimate authority regardless of gender. Both men and women become obedient agents of authority when legitimate authority gives them orders to harm others. The cross-cultural replications prove obedience to authority operates universally across cultures. Milgram's experiments have been replicated in Italy, Germany, Spain, Austria, Jordan, and multiple other countries. Obedience rates vary from 28% to 91% depending on specific experimental variations and cultural contexts. But substantial obedience occurs across all cultures tested. No culture produces universal resistance to authority commands to harm innocent person. Every culture shows majority or substantial minority of participants will obey authority, ordering them to inflict serious harm. This proves obedience to authority isn't Western cultural phenomenon or product of specific cultural values. It's human psychological universal emerging from authority structures present in all human societies. The Nazi connection reveals why Milgram conducted these experiments. Milgram was Jewish American disturbed by Holocaust. Adolf Eichmann's trial occurred in 1961, same year as Milgram experiments. Eichmann orchestrated Holocaust logistics, coordinating deportation of millions to death camps. His defense was just following orders, claiming he was mere bureaucrat executing superiors' commands without personal responsibility for genocide he enabled. Many observers dismissed this defense as transparent lie. Surely person organizing industrial-scale mass murder must be uniquely evil monster, not ordinary person following orders. Milgram wanted to test scientifically whether ordinary people really would commit atrocities when authority commands. The experimental results validated Eichmann's defense as psychologically accurate description of how ordinary people behave under authority. Eichmann probably wasn't lying. He probably did experience himself as agent executing superior orders, rather than autonomous moral agent choosing genocide. Milgram's participants experienced identical psychological state becoming agents of experimenters' will, rather than autonomous individuals making moral choices. The psychological mechanism enabling Holocaust wasn't unique German evil or Nazi ideology creating monsters. It was ordinary human obedience to authority that exists universally across all cultures and operates identically, whether authority commands electric shocks in laboratory or genocide in society. The agentic state explains psychological mechanism transforming moral people into obedient harm executors. In autonomous state, you perceive yourself as individual responsible for your own actions and their consequences. Your moral code guides behavior. You feel guilt and responsibility for harmful actions. But when legitimate authority gives you orders, you transition into agentic state. In agentic state, you perceive yourself as agent executing authority's will. Authority is responsible for consequences. You're merely instrument of authority's intentions. Guilt dissolves because you didn't choose the action. Authority commanded it. Moral responsibility transfers to authority. This isn't conscious rationalization. This is automatic psychological shift happening below conscious awareness when authority issues commands. The self-application is what makes Milgram findings personally devastating. You believe you would refuse orders to harm innocent person. You're confident your morality would prevent you from torturing someone regardless of authority commands. But Milgram proves statistical probability is 65%, that you would administer potentially lethal shocks to screaming victim, begging you to stop simply because authority figure tells you to continue. Your confident belief that you would resist is same confident belief that psychiatrists, students, and adults had before experiment proving everyone systematically underestimates power of authority to override personal morality. You're not special. You're not more moral than Milgram's participants. You would statistically obey evil orders. The police brutality application reveals Milgram operating in law enforcement where authority hierarchy creates systematic abuse. Police officers occupy position of authority over civilians. But officers also exist within police hierarchy, where superior officers in department culture represent authority commanding specific behaviors. When superior officer or department culture implicitly or explicitly commands excessive force against civilians, individual officers obey despite personal moral reservations. Officers experience agentic state becoming agents of department authority rather than autonomous moral agents. They're just following orders, even when orders aren't explicit. Department culture communicating that aggressive policing is expected functions as authority command that officers obey automatically. Officer who would never personally choose to brutalize civilian will brutalize when department authority signals this is expected behavior. Milgram explains police brutality as systematic outcome of authority hierarchy, not individual officer pathology. The corporate fraud application shows Milgram in business contexts where authority commands illegal or unethical actions. Manager tells employee to manipulate financial records, hide safety problems, mislead customers, or break regulations. Employee experiences moral distress, knowing actions are wrong. But manager as authority figure within corporate hierarchy commands these actions. Employee enters agentic state perceiving themselves as agent executing manager's will rather than autonomous person choosing fraud. Responsibility transfers to manager authority. Employee obeys despite moral reservations. Corporate scandals from Enron to Wells Fargo to Theranos follow Milgram pattern, where ordinary employees commit systematic fraud because corporate authority commands it. Employees aren't uniquely immoral. They're ordinary people obeying authority within corporate hierarchy exactly as Milgram's participants obeyed laboratory authority. The military atrocities application reveals Milgram explaining war crimes and civilian massacres. Soldiers receive orders from superior officers to kill civilians, burn villages, or commit acts violating laws of war and personal moral codes. Soldiers enter agentic state becoming agents of military authority. Moral responsibility transfers to commanding officers. Soldiers execute orders that autonomous moral agents would refuse. My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where American soldiers massacred hundreds of unarmed civilians including children and elderly, follows Milgram pattern precisely. Soldiers weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary young men obeying authority commanding them to massacre civilians. Authority commands override moral prohibition against murdering children when military hierarchy issues orders. Milgram explains how ordinary soldiers become mass murderers through obedience to authority. The genocide enabler application shows Milgram operating at mass scale enabling Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, Armenian genocide, and other systematic mass killings. Genocide requires participation of thousands of ordinary people serving as guards, bureaucrats, transporters, and executors. These aren't thousands of uniquely evil sadists. They're ordinary people obeying authority within genocidal regime. They enter agentic state becoming agents of regime authority. Personal moral responsibility dissolves. They're just following orders. This psychological mechanism enables industrial-scale killing because it transforms entire populations into obedient agents, executing authority's will to commit mass murder. Milgram proves genocide doesn't require nation of monsters. It requires authority structure commanding murder, creating agentic state in ordinary people who obediently execute genocidal orders. The medical experimentation application reveals Milgram in healthcare contexts where authority commands harmful actions. Tuskegee syphilis study continued for 40 years, with healthcare workers participating in deliberate denial of treatment to black men to study disease progression. Healthcare workers knew denying treatment was harmful and racially motivated, but medical authority structure commanded continuation. Workers obeyed becoming agents of racist medical authority. Nazi medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners involved hundreds of doctors and nurses who were trained to help people but obeyed authority commanding them to torture and kill prisoners through experiments. Stanford prison experiment guards became abusive because Zimbardo as authority implicitly approved abuse. Medical professionals commit systematic harm when medical authority structure commands or permits it, because professionals enter agentic state obeying medical authority rather than maintaining autonomous moral judgment. The parental obedience application shows Milgram operating in family contexts where children obey harmful parental commands. Parents command children to lie, steal, harm others, or maintain silence about abuse. Children obey parental authority despite knowing actions are wrong. Children experience agentic state, becoming agents of parental will. Responsibility transfers to parent. Child becomes instrument of parent's intentions regardless of moral content. This explains how children participate in family crimes, cover up abuse, or commit harmful acts when parents command. Children aren't inherently immoral. They're obeying parental authority through same psychological mechanism that made Milgram participants administer shocks. Authority override autonomous moral judgment operates universally, including in parent-child relationships, creating child obedience to harmful parental commands. The cult behavior application reveals Milgram explaining how ordinary people commit mass suicide or violence when cult authority commands. Jonestown Massacre, where 900 people, including 300 children, died from drinking poison following Jim Jones's orders, demonstrates Milgram at horrifying scale. Cult members weren't uniquely disturbed. They were ordinary people who entered agentic state responding to cult leader as legitimate authority. When authority commanded death, they obeyed. Heaven's Gate cult members who committed mass suicide obeying cult leader, Branch Davidians who died at Waco following David Koresh, and countless other cult tragedies follow Milgram pattern where authority commands override survival instinct. Authority commanding you to kill yourself produces obedience in substantial percentage of people, proving authority override personal autonomy operates even on most fundamental self-preservation instinct. The terrorism recruitment application shows how ordinary people become suicide bombers and mass killers through authority obedience. Terrorist organizations establish authority hierarchy where leaders command attacks. Recruits who initially joined for social belonging or ideological agreement enter agentic state when authority commands them to kill civilians. They become agents executing authority's will to commit mass murder. Moral responsibility transfers to organizational authority. They're soldiers following orders, not autonomous murderers. This psychological mechanism explains how educated middle-class individuals become suicide bombers. They aren't psychopaths or uniquely disturbed. They're ordinary people obeying authority within terrorist organizational hierarchy. Milgram proves terrorism recruitment doesn't require finding inherently evil people. It requires creating authority structure that commands violence, transforming ordinary people into obedient executors. The resistance impossibility reveals most disturbing implication. Knowing about Milgram doesn't provide immunity from authority obedience. Milgram participants weren't ignorant. They understood they were harming someone. They experienced severe moral distress. But they obeyed anyway because authority commanded continuation. Understanding intellectually that authority can override morality doesn't mean you will successfully resist when actually facing authority commands. Agentic state transition happens automatically below conscious control. You will likely obey authority ordering you to harm innocent person despite knowing about Milgram, despite believing you would resist, despite experiencing moral distress during obedience. Intellectual knowledge doesn't disable psychological mechanism of authority obedience that operates automatically when legitimate authority issues commands. The personal inventory forces examining your own obedience history. Have you obeyed authority figure commanding action you knew was wrong? Have you implemented harmful policy because superior ordered it despite moral reservations? Have you remained silent about wrongdoing because speaking up would challenge authority? Have you participated in institutional harm because that's what authority structure expected? Have you defended harmful actions by claiming you were following orders or that person above you made decision? Honest examination reveals you've already obeyed harmful authority commands multiple times, becoming agent of authority rather than maintaining autonomous moral judgment. You've already demonstrated you obey authority override personal morality. You just haven't faced authority commanding extreme harm yet. But psychological mechanism is identical whether authority commands mild harm or murder. The moral licensing effect explains why people who initially resist small authority commands often obey larger ones. Participants who briefly hesitated before continuing in Milgram experiment felt they'd demonstrated moral character through hesitation. This moral licensing made them feel entitled to continue obeying afterward, having proven they weren't blindly obedient. their resistance to small commands, licensed obedience to larger commands. Modern applications are obvious. Corporate employee who objects to small ethical violation feels they've proven moral character. This licenses obedience when manager commands larger fraud. Police officer who questions small policy violation feels moral, but then obeys when commander orders serious abuse. Moral licensing means initial resistance doesn't predict sustained resistance and often enables worse obedience by creating false sense of moral accomplishment. The gradual escalation enabled Milgram's high obedience rates. Participants didn't start by administering 450 volts. They started with harmless 15 volts. Each subsequent shock was only 15 volts higher than previous shock. Each step seemed like small increment, not dramatic escalation. This gradual escalation prevented clear recognition that line was being crossed. No single moment where participant made conscious choice to become torturer. Instead, they drifted across ethical boundary through accumulation of small escalations, each rationalized as not significantly worse than previous already normalized level. Modern authority structures use identical gradual escalation. Military doesn't start with ordering massacre. It starts with small violations that escalate incrementally. Corporations don't start with massive fraud. They start with small accounting adjustments that gradually escalate. Understanding gradual escalation doesn't prevent you from drifting, because each individual step seems defensible in context of previous normalized behavior. The fundamental attribution error operates in judging Milgram participants. Observers tend to conclude participants who obeyed to maximum shock were weak-willed or immoral people revealing character defects. Observers believe they personally would have resisted because they're stronger or more moral. But Milgram proves this attribution is error. Participants' behavior was determined by situation, not character. Normal moral people become obedient agents when authority commands. You would likely behave identically because behavior in authority situations is determined primarily by authority structure, not individual character, despite intuitive belief that character determines resistance to authority. The ultimate recognition is that you would kill innocent person if legitimate authority ordered you to continue. Not because you're evil, but because human brain automatically transitions into agentic state when authority commands, transferring moral responsibility to authority and making you psychological instrument of authority's will. Your morality isn't inherent character trait that would protect against authority commands. Your morality is situational feature that disappears when authority structure activates obedience mechanisms operating below conscious control. You already obey harmful authority in daily life without recognizing obedience because agentic state makes authority obedience feel like normal, appropriate behavior rather than moral abdication. The corporate hierarchy example reveals daily Milgram obedience operating in professional contexts. Your manager tells you to misrepresent product capabilities to customer. You know this is deceptive and potentially harmful. Your personal ethics say lying to customers is wrong. But manager as authority within corporate hierarchy has commanded specific action. You experience psychological pressure identical to Milgram participants. You might verbally express concern saying, "Are you sure?" mirroring Milgram participants who asked, "Should I really continue?" But when manager reasserts authority with, "This is what we need to do," or "I'm taking responsibility for this decision," you obey. You enter agentic state, becoming agent, executing manager's will. Moral responsibility transfers to manager. You lie to customer. Later you rationalize this as, "I was following manager's directive," exactly as Milgram participants rationalized shocking victim as, "Experimenter told me to continue." Same psychological mechanism, different context. The medical orders application shows healthcare workers obeying harmful physician commands. Nurse knows physician has ordered incorrect medication dosage that could harm patient. Nurse's medical training and personal ethics say questioning obviously wrong order is required. But physician occupies authority position in medical hierarchy. When nurse questions order and physician responds with authoritative reassertion, "I said give this dosage," nurse often obeys despite knowing it's wrong. Nurse enters agentic state. Responsibility transfers to physician authority. Patient receives harmful dosage. Medical errors frequently result from this authority obedience where nurses, technicians, and junior physicians obey obviously incorrect orders from authority figures rather than maintaining autonomous professional judgment. Milgram explains medical errors as authority obedience, not individual incompetence. The military rank structure creates systematic Milgram conditions where soldiers obey commands violating laws of war. Superior officer commands unit to fire on civilians, destroy protected cultural sites, or torture prisoners. Soldiers know these orders violate military law, international law, and personal moral codes. But military hierarchy is designed to create automatic obedience to superior authority. Soldiers who resist orders face court-martial. Soldiers who obey receive institutional protection. Every soldier is trained that obedience to lawful orders is mandatory. But determining whether order is lawful requires autonomous judgment that authority structure suppresses. Soldiers default to obedience entering agentic state, where superior officer is responsible and soldier is merely executing commands. This explains systematic war crimes occurring across all armies throughout history. War crimes aren't aberrations committed by uniquely evil soldiers. They're predictable outcomes of military authority structures creating Milgram obedience conditions, where soldiers obey harmful commands. The parental commands to children demonstrate Milgram in family authority. Parent tells child to lie to other parent about parent's activities. Child knows lying is wrong. Child's developing moral sense says honesty is important. But parent occupies ultimate authority position in child's world. When parent commands lie with, "Tell your mother I was at work, not at the bar," child obeys despite moral reservations. Child enters agentic state, becoming agent of parent's will. This explains how children become accomplices in parental wrongdoing, maintain silence about abuse, or participate in family dysfunction. Children aren't morally deficient. They're obeying parental authority through same mechanism that made Milgram participants shock victims. Authority override moral autonomy operates from earliest childhood, creating obedience patterns that persist throughout life. The educational authority reveals teachers commanding students to engage in harmful peer dynamics. Teacher instructs class to shun particular student as punishment, creating systematic bullying. Students know social exclusion is harmful. Their personal moral sense says treating classmate cruelly is wrong, but teacher represents institutional authority. Students obey teacher's implicit or explicit command to exclude target student. Students enter agentic state. Responsibility for bullying transfers to teacher authority. Students participate in systematic cruelty they wouldn't autonomously choose because authority commanded it. This explains how classroom bullying often has teacher complicity, where authority figure creates conditions for peer abuse through commands or tacit approval that students obey automatically. The religious authority application shows believers obeying harmful commands from religious leaders. Pastor, priest, imam, or rabbi commands congregation member to shun family member, donate beyond financial means, or engage in activity contradicting member's conscience. Member experiences moral conflict knowing command is harmful, but religious leader occupies spiritual authority position. When leader frames command as divine will or spiritual necessity, member obeys entering agentic state. Responsibility transfers to religious authority, representing divine command. Member inflicts harm they wouldn't autonomously choose. This explains religious abuse from financial exploitation to covering up crimes to participating in violence. Believers aren't uniquely gullible. They're obeying religious authority through Milgram mechanism, where legitimate authority override personal moral judgment. The political leader commands reveal citizens obeying harmful directives from governmental authority. Political leader orders supporters to attack opponents, spread misinformation, or commit violence. Supporters know these actions violate law and ethics. But political leader occupies authority position within supporter identity and social structure. When leader commands action, framing it as necessary for cause or nation, supporters obey. They enter agentic state, becoming agents of political authority. Responsibility transfers to leader. Supporters commit violence or spread lies they wouldn't autonomously choose. This explains political violence and extremism as authority obedience, not individual pathology. Ordinary people become political extremists through Milgram mechanism when political authority commands extremism. The resistance strategies reveal limited options for escaping authority obedience. Strategy 1 is recognizing when you're entering agentic state. Notice psychological shift from feeling personally responsible to feeling you're executing authority's will. This awareness might enable resistance, though authority pressure remains overwhelming. Strategy 2 is establishing personal red lines before encountering authority commands. Decide in advance which orders you will refuse regardless of authority. This pre-commitment might provide psychological anchor during actual authority pressure. Strategy 3 is seeking allies who share moral concerns. Milgram showed peer resistance dramatically reduced obedience. Finding one other person questioning authority commands enables joint resistance. Strategy 4 is removing yourself from authority structures that routinely command harmful actions. If corporate culture systematically demands unethical behavior, quit before you become habituated to obeying harmful commands. The cost of resistance explains why obedience remains default, despite knowing its dangers. Individuals who consistently refuse authority commands face severe consequences. They're fired from jobs, expelled from organizations, ostracized from communities, and face legal prosecution if authority has legal power. Milgram participants who refused to continue face no consequences because experiment was voluntary. But in real authority, structure's refusal means losing employment, status, relationships, and freedom. Most people rationally choose obedience over these costs, especially when authority assures them they're not personally responsible for consequences. Obedience is rational calculation, not moral failing, when resistance means professional and social destruction, while obedience means continued belonging and authority's assurance of transferred responsibility. The banality of evil, coined by Hannah Arendt, describes what Milgram documented empirically. Evil doesn't require monsters. Evil requires ordinary people obeying authority. Adolf Eichmann, organizing Holocaust logistics, wasn't sadistic monster. He was bureaucrat obeying superior authority. Milgram participants administering potentially lethal shocks weren't sadists. They were ordinary people obeying experimenter authority. Corporate employees committing fraud aren't uniquely greedy. They're ordinary workers obeying corporate authority. Police officers committing brutality aren't uniquely violent. They're ordinary officers obeying department authority. Soldiers committing war crimes aren't uniquely cruel. They're ordinary soldiers obeying military authority. Evil is ordinary. Evil is systematic. Evil emerges from normal people obeying authority, commanding evil acts through psychological mechanism Milgram documented operating universally across all human populations and authority structures. The Nazi trial's defense of just following orders is legally rejected, but psychologically validated by Milgram. International law established at Nuremberg that following orders is not defense for war crimes or crimes against humanity. Individuals are held personally responsible for criminal actions regardless of authority commands. This legal standard is morally necessary for prosecuting atrocities. But Milgram proves psychologically the defense is accurate. People do experience themselves as merely following orders. They do transfer responsibility to authority. They do enter agentic state. Legal rejection of defense doesn't change psychological reality, that ordinary people obey authority commands to commit atrocities, believing they're not personally responsible because authority commanded actions. Law holds individuals accountable to prevent future atrocities. But psychology reveals individuals genuinely experience diminished autonomy under authority, making just following orders psychologically accurate description, even though legally insufficient defense. The personal responsibility question becomes complex given Milgram findings. If authority obedience is automatic psychological response operating below conscious control, are individuals responsible for obeying harmful commands? Milgram proves they experience diminished autonomy, but holding individuals accountable is necessary for constraining authority structures. Without individual accountability, authority can command any atrocity and claim subordinates were merely obeying, creating complete moral abdication. Individual accountability forces people to resist harmful commands despite psychological difficulty. But accountability must acknowledge that resisting authority is psychologically and practically difficult, not simple matter of moral choice. People who obey harmful authority aren't simply choosing evil. They're experiencing powerful psychological mechanism, making obedience feel mandatory. This doesn't excuse obedience but explains it, requiring both individual accountability and structural reform limiting authority's power to command harm. The institutional reform implications suggest addressing Milgram requires changing authority structures, not just expecting individuals to resist. Organizations should distribute authority, preventing concentration, enabling harmful commands. Create explicit procedures protecting individuals who refuse orders. Establish oversight, preventing authority from operating without accountability. Train people to recognize agentic state and authority obedience mechanisms. Create organizational cultures valuing moral autonomy over blind obedience. These structural changes address root cause, which is authority structures systematically producing obedience to harmful commands. Expecting individuals to resist without structural support ensures most will obey, because psychological and practical costs of resistance are too high absent institutional protection. The recognition that you're obeying authority right now in reading this analysis reveals inescapability. You're accepting analytical framework provided with apparent authority. You're conforming to intellectual consensus that psychological research reveals important truths. You're obeying implicit authority of academic discourse, requiring you to engage seriously with empirical findings. Even if you're disagreeing, you're doing so within framework that authority structure of academia and rational discourse provides. Genuine autonomy would require rejecting all authority frameworks and thinking purely independently. But this is psychologically impossible. You exist within social structures providing authority frameworks you automatically reference and obey. You cannot escape authority obedience by being aware of it, because awareness itself operates within authority frameworks you're embedded in throughout life. The Milgram Obedience Experiment documented that you would administer potentially lethal electric shocks to innocent screaming victims simply because authority figure tells you to continue. You would torture. You would kill. You would enable genocide. Not because you're evil, but because you're human, and humans automatically obey legitimate authority, entering agentic state, where moral responsibility transfers to authority, and you become psychological instrument executing authority's commands, regardless of moral content. The workplace meeting scenario illustrates daily Milgram obedience most people experience regularly. Boss proposes strategy you recognize as harmful to customers or employees. As meeting progresses, other team members voice agreement, creating social pressure, reinforcing authority command. When your turn to speak arrives, you face identical psychological situation as Milgram participants. Speaking dissent means contradicting authority and group consensus, risking professional consequences. Remaining silent or voicing agreement means participating in harmful decision violating your professional ethics. Most people choose obedience. They enter agentic state. Responsibility transfers to boss. They voice agreement or remain silent, enabling harmful strategy. Later they rationalize, "I'm not the decision maker," or "I was implementing boss's strategy," exactly as Milgram participants rationalized shocking victim as following experimenter's protocol. Same authority obedience mechanism operates whether laboratory or conference room. The customer service lie example shows low-stakes Milgram creating pattern of obedience. Supervisor tells you to tell customers that product has features it doesn't have, or to deny valid complaints to avoid refunds. You know this is deceptive and harmful to customers. Your personal ethics say lying is wrong. But supervisor as workplace authority has commanded specific deception. You experience moral conflict. When you express concern, supervisor reasserts authority with, "This is company policy," or "Just do what I'm telling you." You obey, entering agentic state. Responsibility transfers to supervisor and company policy. You lie to customers repeatedly throughout workday. Each lie reinforces obedience pattern. You become habituated to obeying harmful authority commands in low-stakes situations. This habituation prepares you to obey when stakes escalate to serious fraud or safety violations. Milgram progression from harmless early shocks to potentially lethal final shocks mirrors workplace progression, from small lies to major fraud through gradual habituation to authority obedience. The healthcare error scenario demonstrates life or death Milgram consequences. Surgeon tells operating room nurse to use wrong surgical instrument that could cause patient harm. Nurse knows this is dangerous. Medical training says questioning obvious errors is mandatory. But surgeon occupies ultimate authority in operating room hierarchy. When nurse questions, "Doctor, are you sure you want that instrument?" Surgeon responds authoritatively, "I know what I'm doing, give me that instrument." Nurse obeys, entering agentic state. Responsibility transfers to surgeon. Patient suffers complication from wrong instrument. Medical error investigations often find nurses and technicians knew procedures were wrong, but obeyed physician authority rather than refusing to participate. Milgram explains medical errors killing thousands annually as authority obedience, not ignorance or incompetence. The resistance markers help identify when you're entering agentic state before obedience becomes automatic. Physical markers include anxiety, nervous laughter, sweating, trembling identical to what Milgram participants displayed. Psychological markers include feeling, "You must obey," despite moral reservations, shifting responsibility to authority figure, rationalizing harmful action as following orders or implementing policy. Verbal markers include asking authority, "Are you sure?" while expecting authority to resolve your moral conflict rather than making autonomous moral decision. When you notice these markers, you're entering agentic state. Conscious recognition might enable resistance, though authority pressure remains overwhelming. Creating personal protocol for responding to these markers before encountering actual authority commands might strengthen resistance capacity. Though Milgram proves intellectual preparation has limited effectiveness against actual authority pressure. The authority legitimacy question reveals that obedience depends on perceiving authority as legitimate. Milgram participants obeyed because Yale experimenter in lab coat represented legitimate scientific authority. When experimenter lacked scientific credentials, obedience dropped. When experiment occurred in rundown office rather than prestigious institution, obedience dropped. This proves obedience isn't automatic response to anyone giving orders. Obedience requires perceiving authority as legitimate within relevant domain. But determining legitimacy happens quickly and automatically based on contextual cues like institutional affiliation, credentials, position in hierarchy, and confidence of authority's demeanor. You automatically assess authority legitimacy and obey when assessment concludes authority is legitimate. This happens below conscious deliberation, making you obey, before rationally evaluating whether authority actually deserves obedience in this specific situation. Your confident belief you would resist authority ordering you to harm innocent person is identical to confident belief everyone had before Milgram proved 65% obey to maximum shock. Your morality is situational illusion that disappears when authority issues commands. You already obey harmful authority in daily professional, family, and social contexts without recognizing obedience because agentic state makes authority obedience feel normal and appropriate rather than moral abdication. Recognition of authority obedience mechanism doesn't provide immunity because mechanism operates automatically below conscious control. You will obey authority commanding evil not through conscious choice to abandon morality, but through automatic psychological transition into agentic state that happens when legitimate authority issues commands. Situation determines behavior. Authority overrides morality, and you are not immune. The dark psychology of Milgram reveals that evil requires only legitimate authority commanding harm, and ordinary people obeying creating systematic evil through banal obedience that feels psychologically like responsible behavior, rather than moral catastrophe enabling atrocities throughout human history, and continuing in every authority hierarchy you participate in, currently including your workplace, your family, your community, and every institutional context where authority issues. Commands you obey automatically believing you're being responsible when you're actually abandoning moral autonomy to become instrument of authority's will, regardless of whether that will is benevolent or evil. Subscribe to Umbral Fables as we continue to open the forbidden archives and explore the shadows of the myths that built us. This is Umbral Fables. We leave you now, not with comfort, but with questions. Look closely. The dark journey continues.